Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this program today we'll be discussing how the European Union is illegally funding Palestinian settlements in Israel. Warm welcome to the programme, and today's special guest needs no introduction. He's all the way from Sussex, England. He is Hugh Kitson, the legendary filmmaker and documentary maker, and a good friend of mine as well. Hugh, it's always a pleasure to see you on the Middle East Report, and you always bring something new to the programme. So you are currently making a new documentary film called The Trojan Horse that looks at how the European Union is illegally funding and building Palestinian settlements in Israel in an area known as Area C in the biblical heartland of Israel known as Judea and Samaria. You're also wanting to finish part two of Whose Land, but can you just give us an update on the filming of the second part of Whose Land and give us a bit of context about what it's about?
Well, I can very happily tell you, and I give thanks to the Lord for it, that I was in Israel a couple of weeks ago with Colonel Richard Kemp, and we actually finished filming part two of Whose Land. So we've got the post-production ahead of us, but we're making very good progress with it. Excellent.
And can you also share with us of why and how documentaries are so important in bringing awareness on certain issues? In this case with Whose Land, it's all about Israel's historic and legal right to the land of Israel. How important is it that you record interviews with experts? There's a documentary sharing the truth about Israel. As we know, when it comes to Israel, there is a real battle for truth and so much lies and misinformation.
Yes, there certainly is a lot of misinformation. A documentary, I believe, is very important. People are not reading so much as they used to, and Whose Land looks at the legitimacy of Israel in her promised land, going back to the Bible. And the first part of it, which we released back in 2017, just before the centenary of the Balfour Declaration, looks at the foundation of the modern state of Israel, both historically and legally, and takes us up to 1948 and Ben-Gurion's Independence Declaration. From here on in, part two looks at the War of Independence, the illegality of the invasion by the Arabs, and Britain's actually backing of it. And we go right through almost to the present day, and we look at various points like the Six-Day War, which is very badly misrepresented in the media. It's almost portrayed as if Israel actually invaded Egypt and Judea and Samaria. Well, actually that's not true. It was the Arabs who those Arab nations were setting out to destroy the nation of Israel and create maybe another genocide, but that didn't happen. And so we look at the international law behind that. We go all the way through the International Court of Justice, before that, Resolution 242. What is it really all about?
The land for peace.
Exactly, the land for peace. And it's often misrepresented. So we're basically trying to put the record straight, and we go right up to Resolution 2334, which is the Security Council resolution right at the end of the Obama era, which declared that any Jewish or Israeli presence in what they call the occupied Palestinian territories, by the way, we take that term apart as well, the UN resolution said it was illegal, of gross violation of international law. Well, actually, it's nothing of the kind. It's really nothing of the kind, and not only that, but it contravenes the UN Charter as well.
So let's have a look now at the trailer for Whose Land that really does tell Israel's narrative, and it's so important that Israel tells a story, but this is the historical and legal rights to the modern state of Israel. Whose Land?
Joseph Goebbels, who was Hitler's architect of the campaign to brand the Jewish people as a subhuman race in Nazi Germany, was quoted as saying, "If a lie is repeated often enough, then the people will believe it." A similar tactic is being used today in the propaganda war waged against Israel by Islam and the pro-Palestinian factions in the Middle East.
لكن نحن في مدارسنا نعلم ما يوليه علينا ديننا وضميرنا لأن القدس هي عربية وأن فلسطين من شمالها لجنوبها من نهرها لبحرها هي عربية فلسطينية إسلامية وستبقى كذلك رغم أنف هذا المحتل اللعين.
At the heart of the propaganda war against Israel is the use of fake history and lawfare, the revision and deliberate misrepresentation of international law. Whose Land is a documentary film looking at the legitimacy of Israel in international law with a highly qualified group of historians and international lawyers.
Article 80 of the UN Charter assumes the powers that were given to the League of Nations, so that anything that was decided under the League of Nations, such as the San Remo resolution, such as the mandate for Palestine, are still legally binding under the UN Charter.
It becomes part of international law.
Whose Land does not set out to justify the right of Israel to exist. Instead, it simply tells the truth.
The attempt of the modern Palestinians to say, oh, we go back to antiquity, there always were Palestinians here, is rubbish in historical terms.
Media coverage of the Middle East and even United Nations resolutions use terminology such as occupied Palestinian territory and the illegal occupation. Is this terminology based on international law, or is it simply anti-Israel propaganda?
The term Palestinian territories, or occupied Palestinian territories, or OPT, which is used in virtually every General Assembly resolution in the UN, this expression has got absolutely no basis whatsoever. It's utter nonsense.
The Arab rejection of Resolution 181 precludes the Arabs from any legal claim they might otherwise have to that territory.
Jordan, Syria, Egypt had no claim to Jerusalem or the West Bank on the basis of any doctrinal principle of international law.
And so the Jewish settlements and the claim for Israel to exercise jurisdiction over the West Bank, I think, is legally supported, certainly by Article 80 of the UN Charter.
Will the two-state solution really bring peace to the Middle East?
The Palestinian Authority, through the frameworks that it controls, television, Ministry of Education, goes out of its way to tell its children that Israelis can never be peace partners, because the problem is not land and the problem is not Israel. The problem is our essence as Jews.
أعداء الله أبناء الخنازير وقطعوا أسلاءهم بالحجارة والسكاكين ودنسوا كتاب الله على مرء الملايين. أين أمة الإسلام والمجاهدين؟ أين مخافة الله في القدس قد دنست بالصهايين.
I don't think that there is an interest of the Palestinian leader to solve the conflict.
نحيي كل ذرة دم أريقت في سبيل القدس، فهي دماء نظيفة، دماء نقية، دماء في سبيل الله إن شاء الله، وكل شهيد سيكون في الجنة وكل جريح سيكتب له الله الثواب. هذا الأقصى لنا والقيامة لنا كلها لنا لا يحق لهم أن يدنسوها بأقدامهم القذرة.
I think that the Oslo can be considered as that tragedy for the Palestinian people.
Join me, Richard Kemp, in the two-part documentary film Whose Land, as we uncover the true story behind the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
And for those of you who haven't seen Whose Land, it's definitely worth a watch if you want to really know Israel's historical and legal right to the modern state of Israel. A must watch. Hugh, we recorded a program, I think last year on Whose Land, when it was actually premiered at the Begin Center in Jerusalem, associated with the late Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, one of Israel's great warrior prime ministers. Can you share with us how that went and the response that you've had since from Israel and also the Jewish community? Because clearly it's done very well because you're filming and been filming part 2, so it must have gone down well.
Well, yes, I believe it has. I mean, we've been waiting all these years for to be able to do part 2, and as I said earlier, part 2 really focuses on the legal claim to Israel in international law, actually to sovereignty over the whole of Judea and Samaria, as well as Jerusalem. Because I think it's getting to a stage now where, and we're going to talk about this a bit later with the Palestinian takeover of Area C, that I think that Israel is going to be forced to do what has thus far been resisted, and that is to declare and exercise sovereignty, certainly over areas of Area C. I believe in God's purposes the timing of this may be very pertinent, because if that happens, the Israeli government really need to show that they have every right in international law to do what they would have to do.
Absolutely, which would also be very difficult if they chose to do that, not having any kind of international support, certainly not from the Biden administration, not from the EU, and as we'll find out through this program, yes, that the EU is not an even player in this, and clearly has a vested interest, more than a vested interest, to help to create a Palestinian state. But why, there's been a lot of documentaries about Israel. Why in part 2 have you decided to focus on the modern history of Israel, from the Israel's War of Independence in 48, when she was attacked by 5 Arab armies, right through to the Six-Day War of June 1967, the Yom Kippur War, and then kind of up to date in terms of where Israel stands legally and how she came to acquire Judea and Samaria, East Jerusalem, and also including the Golan Heights?
Well, even in the period from 67 onwards, the history itself has been misrepresented. Take Resolution 242. It's interpreted or said that Israel has to retreat to the 1949 armistice lines, often referred to as the 1967 borders. And legally they're not borders, and we show why in part 2. So that's just one small thing. As far as I know, I don't think anyone has made a documentary on the legitimacy of Israel in international law in Judea and Samaria. And I believe that this is now becoming very, very timely.
Absolutely. So let's have a look at this exclusive extract of Whose Land Part 2, of course starring Colonel Richard Kemp, talking about Israel's War of Independence, that Israel defeated 5 Arab armies in 1948.
A 1,000 soldiers from Jordan's Arab Legion attacked the Jewish quarter of the old city of Jerusalem. For 13 days, fewer than 200 Jewish men and women with limited arms and ammunition held off the assaults of the British-trained Arab Legion. By 28th of May, food and ammunition had run out, and reinforcements had been unable to break through. Pillars of smoke marked the surrender of the Jewish inhabitants of the old city. Today, this monument bears witness to the 69 heroic defenders aged from 10 to 84 who died defending their city.
I think it's impossible for the Jewish people, for the Israelis today, to forget what happened in 1948. Thereafter, in the years that followed, dozens of synagogues were completely destroyed, including their most significant synagogue in the old city, the Urva synagogue. Jewish cemeteries were desecrated.
The Jewish people were ethnically cleansed from their ancient capital city. Apart from a period of 200 years following the crushing of the Bar Kokhba uprising by the Romans in 135 AD, Jewish people had lived in the walled old city of Jerusalem continuously since the Babylonian exile. Now they were exiled again.
Everything that had significance from a Jewish point of view was destroyed or desecrated. That's what happened when the Arabs took over. Jews were not permitted to enter the old city and pray at the Western Wall.
Dov Chaikin lived in Jerusalem from 1928 and had served as a volunteer in the British Army at the Battle of El Alamein.
For 19 years, I couldn't visit the old city. I couldn't visit the wall.
Those 19 years of forced exile from the walled old city of Jerusalem would change the perception of the legal rights of the Jewish people to their ancient capital city, which became falsely known as Arab East Jerusalem. In 1950, matters were made worse when Jordan illegally annexed the historic Jewish capital and all of the Jewish people's heartland of Judea and Samaria.
Jordan, Syria, Egypt had no claim to Jerusalem or the West Bank on the basis of any doctrinal principle of international law.
That annexation was only recognized by Britain and Pakistan. No Arab state recognized that annexation.
The United Nations didn't recognize Jordan's annexation either. The Jordanians renamed the captured territory the West Bank. But with Britain as one of the permanent members of the UN Security Council with the power of veto, what should have been a UN denunciation of Jordan's illegal occupation of the West Bank and East Jerusalem was never likely to happen.
I think it's really arguable that Great Britain was fundamentally itself in breach of the UN Charter by being involved in the attack on Israel in May 1948. And therefore, I think any resolution which directly or indirectly accepts the validity of that attack is also in breach of the UN Charter.
The Arab rejection of Resolution 181 precludes the Arabs from any legal claim they might otherwise have to that territory. And moreover, the Arabs have actually not even recognized the right of the Jewish people to have a sovereign state.
In the next episode of Whose Land, we examine the terms of the 1949 armistice lines between Israel and her enemies and their legal status today.
There we go. We're very blessed to have the exclusive first preview of Whose Lands Are Part 2. So you can say you saw it first on the Middle East Report. Yeah, and I'm appreciative of you of letting us see the second part of Whose Land Anyway, an extract of it, which looks very good. And I think it's so important to tell Israel's history, but also to tell the history of Judea and Samaria, because everyone thinks that this land there is no Jewish connection to the West Bank, but we know that this is Israel's biblical heartland. This is where we have the stories of where the ark rested at Shiloh. This is where David beat Goliath. This is where King Saul was anointed the first king of Israel. And its heritage, its biblical heritage, is absolutely immense. And you only have to go there and see it and realize yourself why there's such a battle for it. And so it's also important to realize that, the Jordanians claimed that was their territory, and then I think in 1988 they renounced it over during the first Palestinian Intifada, and from there we have this constant battle for this land and the territory. Now, you filmed there, you've been there, we've both been there. Why do you think there is such a spiritual battle and fight over that land known as Judea and Samaria, or the biblical heartland?
Well, I do believe that the nations of the world, and the Palestinians are leading this, are trying to disinherit the Jewish people to the land of Israel, and especially their biblical heartland, and especially to their capital, Jerusalem. And the bottom line of this conflict is the return of the Lord Jesus. As I've often said before, he's not returning to Al-Quds, as the Arabic term is, or Arabic name, as the capital of an Islamic Palestinian state. He's returning to be King of Israel on the throne of David. But I'd just like to pick up a point you just mentioned there, because this is something else. We don't look at the spiritual heritage in Whose Land. We look at it through the eyes of international law. And you mentioned there that Jordan renounced its title claim in 1988, which is true. They did that in favor of the Palestinians. And this is something that we look at later on in part 2. There is a principle of international law. There are a few that we look at that are generally not known, but there's a principle of international law. I'm trying to remember the Latin name. I think it's ex injuria jus non oritur.
Very impressive.
Okay, and well, I'll tell you what it means. Basically, something that was illegally obtained, as was what the Jordanians renamed as the West Bank, in an aggressive war, cannot be used as a legal basis following on from that. So to put it mildly, or to put it in more colloquial terms, what the Jordanian government was doing was handing over stolen property to the PLO. It was illegal. So not only was the acquiring of it illegal, but the handing over it had no legal basis either.
And of course, what the late King Hussein of Jordan was very, very concerned about, considering that 70 or 80% of his population is the Palestinian Arabs, was to think that there could be an intifada within Jordan, and the Hashemites would be overthrown in a coup, and he'd lose power, and this would be the end of the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. I think that's why he did it. But at the same time, we also see that the Palestinians and the PLO want to use Judea and Samaria as a building block in order to create a Palestinian state, and then to get a strong state in which they can then destroy the state of Israel. That's what we're dealing with spiritually, and also what we're dealing with in reality. But can you share with us about your new film? Because this is more kind of journalistic in its kind of content. You're not looking at the history of Israel, not looking at Israel's legality under the international law. You are actually putting the microscope on the European Union and how it is illegally funding and building Palestinian settlements. We've heard of Jewish settlements, but not Palestinian settlements, in the area known as Area C in Israel, which is in Judea and Samaria, which is in total Israeli control, unlike areas A and B, which A is completely controlled by the Palestinian Authority. Area A is. Area B is a mixed control between the Palestinian Authority and Israel with checkpoints. And C is total Israeli control and authority.
Yeah, that's correct. Trojan Horse is basically about the Fayyad plan. I've got a copy of the Fayyad plan here. It dates back to 2009. Salam Fayyad at that time was the Palestinian Authority Prime Minister. He was not a jihadist in the sense that either Yasser Arafat was, or even Mahmoud Abbas is today. I mean, I'm talking about jihad, against Israel. He was probably the only prime minister of the Palestinian Authority who was actually interested in state building. But, and this is a big but, the essence of the plan was that they would take over Area C, which is under Israeli control, step by step. Now, it's very interesting when Yasser Arafat first signed the Oslo Accords in 1993, he was denounced by a lot of the Islamist Arab nations around him. They thought that, that he was betraying the Palestinian cause and the Arab Muslim cause for the eradication of the Jewish state. And it's very interesting, one of his henchmen in the PLO, a man called Faisal Husseini, who was actually related to the former Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, in Arabic he tried to sell this whole concept of what the PLO intention was behind signing the Oslo Accords, and he said, it's like a Trojan horse.
So in other words, the phased plan.
The phased plan, which actually Mahmoud Abbas hatched in 1974. So this is what is behind the whole thing. Now, while Fayyad himself wasn't a jihadist, in fact, some Palestinians didn't like him at all. They thought he was too soft on Israel. But nonetheless, the people like Tony Blair, who was the Quartet Middle East envoy at the time, he was very much in favor of this. And of course, the European Union adopted it, and they have channeled hundreds of millions of euros into this whole project of what they call state building. But as we'll see in various clips, we'll get more behind it.
Well, according to the Jerusalem Post, over the past 7 years, the EU has spent over 50 billion euros of European taxpayers' money, I'm so glad we're out of the EU, to this illegal building project that wants to create facts on the ground and effectively, secretly building a de facto Palestinian state. Yes. Without the Palestinian Authority being able to enter into negotiations with Israel and make concessions needed for peace. So we know that this is sinister. This also takes away the EU's role when it signed up to the Oslo Accords, the peace treaty between Israel and the PLO back in '93, which stated that they would be an impartial mediator to help try and to actually bring about the success of the Oslo Accords. And now we see that they are actually de facto working for the creation of a Palestinian state and spending billions of European taxpayers' money to do that. Tell us about how that this is a crime for Israel, but also for residents and taxpayers across the European Union.
Well, I don't think too many taxpayers across the European Union realise And by the way, Britain, when we were part of the European Union, were very much involved in all of this. But how many taxpayers realize that their money is being used in contravention of the Oslo Accords? And it beggars belief, really, that this has been allowed to happen. And surely the European Union must realize, as the other Western nations do, that the Palestinians, as part of Oslo, were supposed to renounce terrorism. They've done nothing of the sort. And you've got rivalry between the Palestinian Authority, which is basically run by the PLO, and Hamas. Well, we saw what happened in Gaza after the Israelis pulled out in 2007. What if you get a Palestinian state in all of Judea and Samaria using the 1949 armistice lines, which were never intended to be international borders? Jordan signed that. What happens if Hamas takes over in what is known today as the West Bank?
I think two things will happen. The first thing is we're going to see rockets and missiles fired from the Judean hills into Israel proper. It will mean a complete shutdown of Israel's international airport, Ben Gurion Airport. Israel's coastal cities such as Tel Aviv, Netanya and others will be in the direct firing line of Hamas's rockets and missiles. Absolutely. And then the other consequence will be it will lead to a revolution in Jordan and bring about the collapse of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. So the consequences for peace, stability and security in the Middle East are absolutely frightening. But let's have a look now at an excellent CBN news report that looks into how the European Union is funding illegal Palestinian settlements in Israeli territory.
Israel's Supreme Court approved the evacuation and demolition of Khan al-Ahmar settlement in 2018. Although successive Israeli governments didn't take action, Netanyahu is now being challenged to do so.
We are here because this is our land. When it comes to illegal building in Judea and Samaria, you cannot have double standards. We saw what happened last Friday when the authorities evacuated Jewish community that was built illegally.
Khan al-Ahmar behind me is one of 80 settlements built in an area called E1 along Israel's main highway between Jerusalem and the Dead Sea. Israel says they're illegal because they're built by Palestinians with European Union money on Israeli land.
It's not just about Khan al-Ahmar, it's about the future of Judea and Samaria and the future of our ability to have a rule of law here in Judea and Samaria.
Likud Knesset members Danny Danon and Yuli Edelstein visited E1 overlooking Khan al-Ahmar. They hope Netanyahu will evacuate it, setting a precedent for the removal of dozens of other illegal Palestinian settlements in biblical Judea and Samaria.
Strategically, this area is very important and sensitive. For us, it is the bridge between Jerusalem to the Dead Sea. That's why the Palestinian Authority is putting so much energy, so much money.
The 1993 Oslo Accords designate areas in the West Bank called A and B under some degree of Palestinian control. Khan al-Ahmar is in Area C under complete Israeli control. Meir Deutsch runs Regavim, a group dedicated to preventing illegal seizure of state land in Area C in what they consider biblical Judea and Samaria.
The black is where the Palestinians have been building. Within areas A and B, you see that 70% of areas A and B, again, under full Palestinian control, 70% of the land is not occupied.
Israel has already allocated other land for the people of Khan al-Ahmar to live on near Jerusalem.
The settlers of Khan al-Ahmar are interested, and we have it on tape. They are interested in moving to these legal plots, but the Palestinian Authority is not allowing them to move because the Palestinian Authority wants them to stay exactly over here, as I said, in the strategic place.
Palestinian protesters told journalists otherwise.
Why to move? This is the land for me as an indigenous Palestinian.
By taking this area, this land here, they just cut off the West Bank with the south from the north. This is part of the plans destroying any possibility for Palestinian state. So this is a Palestinian land. Israel is dealing with it as an Israeli land. It's not an Israeli land.
It's also about the involvement of the European Union, which leads to more complications.
The EU is very involved here in funding the illegal building here.
The EU is supplying them with illegal structures and with illegal electricity infrastructure, such as generators.
No European country can decide that they will construct illegally schools or kindergartens and then will protest the possible evacuation.
And as outside influence into the battle over the land of Israel continues, so do the internal struggles in Netanyahu's government. Julie Stahl, CBN News, overlooking Khan al-Ahmar in the hills of Judea.
Excellent report there put together by CBN, and we need to know what's going on because this has serious implications for Israel's security. The EU has no right to effectively fund and build illegal Palestinian settlements in Israeli territory, trying to change the status quo. And that's why it's important that this issue is raised. Hugh, I did a program on this one in September of 2009 with Edwin Black, the New York Times bestseller. And we covered this issue then. So it's interesting now, almost 4 years later, to see the development of this project. And we know that under President Trump's presidency, the whole peace process was pushed back. There wasn't a great deal of diplomatic involvement. Of course, that will change when Biden occupied the White House beginning of 2021. And the European Union obviously then felt, well, we're not going to face any repercussions from the Trump administration. Let's carry on funding this. So, according to my notes here, Area C of Judea and Samaria represents 60% of what we know as Judea and Samaria, the biblical heartland of Israel, what the world calls the West Bank. Now, why is this territory strategically so important to Israel, and what would it mean if the EU continue in this building project, control that territory, and then this becomes part of a Palestinian state?
Well, there's no doubt that it would become an existential threat to the future of the Jewish state. And I believe this is one reason why it's actually happening, certainly from the Palestinian point of view. I mean, they would command a strategic view of the West right across the Sharon Valley, Ben Gurion Airport, the coastal cities, Netanya right down to Tel Aviv and further up, and to the east they could connect with Jordan as well. So it really would be an existential threat, and especially if you had Hamas running it. Now, yes, Area C in area actually is about 60% of Judea and Samaria, but actually the Palestinians have altered that. What was 60-40 is now 60-40 in favor of the Palestinians. And in the end of 2018, I believe there were 28,000 illegal structures, Palestinian structures, in Area C. At the end of last year, the end of 2022, there were as many as 81,000. So the whole thing has really accelerated.
And you've been there at first hand, so just share with us your experience of actually visiting.
This is what really inspired us to do this film, Trojan Horse, because that's exactly what it is. My cameraman, Leonard Firet, and I were there end of November, beginning of December, and Naomi Khan, who is director of the international division of Regavim, you saw there another director of Regavim. I think he's the CEO. I've not met him. And she spent a whole day with us, took us around the Jerusalem area. She took us to Khan al-Ahmar. She took us to various other illegal Palestinian settlements. And she also took us to Efrat. And Efrat is virtually surrounded now by illegal Palestinian buildings that have gone up. And they're not just tin shacks, which a lot of them are. They're using Bedouin as foot soldiers on the one hand, and they're also building these almost tower blocks of flats. And they're really taking the whole place over. And it shocked us. The extent of what we saw shocked us. And I felt that we needed to expose this.
No, absolutely. So according to the Jerusalem Centre for Public Affairs, they say that the actions on behalf of the EU are unilaterally advancing a Palestinian state in Area C. Already they control Area A, and Area B is disputed and shared between Israeli and Palestinian security forces with checkpoints in place as well. But Area C was total Israeli control. Says here, territories assigned to both Israel, both administratively and regarding security responsibilities by both the PLO and Israel in a mutually signed agreement on the 28th of September 1995 represent a violation of international law and call into question the EU's ability to continue to serve in any capacity as a diplomatic interlocutor in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. So we see here, haven't we, that the European Union has overstepped the mark. It's actually breaching international law. But why is it that, for example, that if Israel builds homes in Judea and Samaria, which is the biblical heartland of Israel, and this is actually Israel's spiritual legal right to do so, because this is the homeland of the Jewish people. After all, Judea comes from the word Jews, and that's where it stems from. And yet here we see the Palestinian Authority being supported directly by the European Union in breach of international law and building the illegal settlements.
Well, this is part of what we know as anti-Semitism or Judeophobia. If a building or even a group of buildings goes up within an existing township, there's an outcry, say Shiloh, where the Ark rested for 300 plus years. They build a new school or a community centre or more residential blocks. There's an international outcry, and yet the Palestinian Authority, they put up, as I've said, 81,000 of them over a period of a decade and more. This is being aided and abetted by the international community, not just the European Union, but also the UN as well. It makes me wonder why they're doing this. They know that Israel is threatened by particularly the Palestinian hatred. They know there's terrorist activity being funded by the PA. So why are they doing it? That's a huge question, and one that I think is very, very worrying indeed.
Well, I think that's a very good question, but I think it's more of a kind of sinister motives are at play, and dark forces are at play in this as well. Particularly, we know Europe's historic relationship with the Jewish community across Europe. We only have to remember the Holocaust of over 80 years ago, and the European Union after the Yom Kippur War of 73 decided to pursue extremely hostile policies towards Israel. So effectively, you question whether they actually want Israel as and full diplomatic relations with Israel. But the big question is, what is the Israeli government response to this? How are they responding to this, to the European Commission, to the European Parliament and to the EU institutions by calling out this illegal funding of billions of European taxpayers' money being pumped into this illegal project of building illegal Palestinian settlements on Israeli territory?
Well, just before the current government took office, 40 Knesset members wrote to the European Union and basically accused them of anti-Semitism and wanting to trash the Jewish state and the Jewish heritage. And I don't know which 40 members of the Knesset it was, but that was the result of the leaking of a document in mid-December of a European Union internal document. And of course they were asked to account for that. And they said, we won't comment on an internal document.
Yeah, so here we go. There's an extract of the internal document, probably a bit small for you to read, but I can read bits of it. It says here, the Joint European Development Programme for Area C discussion notes, June the 22nd, 2022, confidential, not for circulation. It says, the purpose of the present note is to give an overview of the EU's approach in Area C programme and propose a number of strategic reorientations with a view to maximise the impact of our engagement towards a viable two-state solution. This should be on the basis of a joint and multi-annual programme of Area C under the new MEF 2021 to 2027, in line with the joint European strategy of 21 to 2024, and then goes on to say, for example, momentum towards enhanced political engagement. The European Union is committed to contribute to building a Palestinian state within the 1967 borders and mobilise to this purpose its political and financial tools. The European Joint Development Programme for Area C, articulated within the EU's policy objective to protecting the viability of the two-state solution with an independent, democratic and continuous and viable Palestinian state living side by side with Israel in peace, prosperity and security with the State of Israel. It's aimed at defending the rights of Palestinians living in Area C and preserving Area C as part of a future Palestinian state in line with the Oslo Accords. That's what they put out. That's the secret memo. And yet we can completely pick that apart because, but essentially, Area C under the Oslo Accords was given to the Israelis to minister and control. So the European Union has no right to advance that. I mean, you mentioned earlier in the programme about the 1967 UN Resolution 242 that Britain came up with, a whole land for peace, on the concept that Israel would give land away in terms of recognition of Israel's right to exist, but Israel living in secure borders. What the EU is effectively doing is ignoring UN Resolution 242, only recognising Israel's border up until what the UN Resolution 181 of the armistice lines after the Israel's War of Independence in 48, and that this makes Israel strategically vulnerable in a Palestinian state, where Israel wouldn't be able to defend herself against Hamas-run Palestinian Authority. So to say that the two nations would be living in peace and safety and prosperity when the Palestinian Authority, together with Hamas, want to see the destruction of the modern state of Israel, what kind of fantasy land is the EU and the EU Commission living in?
Well, an unbelievable fantasy land. I mean, they've witnessed what's gone on. They've witnessed the flagrant violation of the Oslo Accords by the Palestinians, slaughtering Israelis. It's happening pretty well as we speak now. And they know jolly well that the Palestinian National Charter of 1964-68 calls for the destruction of the Jewish state. And I'm afraid to say this, but I believe it's true, that the European Union are aiding and abetting that.
Absolutely. So let's have a look at the extract of Hugh Kitson's new documentary called The Trojan Horse.
The original Oslo agreements, the first one in 1993, the big Oslo agreement in 1995, known as the interim agreement, had a clause in them. It was called Article 31. And it said, neither side shall change the status of the West Bank and Gaza Strip prior to the completion of the permanent status negotiations. If the Palestinians try and change the status of the territory without negotiating with Israel, that is a unilateral act which violates this commitment. Now, why is this particularly important for Europe? Because when the interim agreement was signed with that critical clause at the White House in the presence of President Clinton, the European Union signed the agreement as well as a witness. What they're essentially doing is lending a hand to a violation of a written agreement to which they are also signatories.
None of this would happen without the international community's active support. As a matter of fact, the European Union has aided the Palestinian government in planning out its annexation of the entire Judea and Samaria. Each country takes responsibility for the planning and the development of different areas in Area C. They build into their contracts demolitions and legal representation because they know that it's illegal and these things should and will be challenged in Israeli courts. And it doesn't seem to bother them that they are completely violating not only international law, but the sovereignty of an allied nation.
This EU policy, which is explicitly aimed at creating the facts on the ground that it believes will cause Area C to be part of a future Palestinian state, which is entirely contrary to the framework set out in the Oslo Accords in two respects. First, in that it rides roughshod over the requirement for final status negotiations. And second, because it blatantly disregards Israel's retained authority and jurisdiction over Area C in its entirety.
The interference of foreign governments, mainly the European governments, in what's happening here in the region, it's outrageous. You know, they support illegal activities in Area C. They support illegal activities of NGOs who are provoking violence every week against our soldiers. This is unacceptable.
The EU's approach is shockingly partisan and biased, and it is promoting an extremely harmful agenda with negative consequences for all the parties. Now, apart from the illegal building, there is also, of course, the issue of terrorism. One of the central and least ambiguous provisions in the Accords commits the Palestinians to actively prevent terror rather than encouraging or financing it.
There we go, another exclusive for the Middle East Report, thanks to Hugh Kitson. So this is going to be his forthcoming documentary called Trojan Horse that looks how the EU is illegally funding and building Palestinian settlements in Israeli territory. I just want to give you a quote here from Dan Diker. He's the president of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. Wrote an excellent article on this topic recently. He said that the EU's unpublished policy plan also violates Israel's legal rights as it affirmed by the EU at Oslo, and reveals a pro-PLO bias that renders the EU as a de facto supporter of the official PA policy of allocating payments to Palestinian terrorists who were killed, captured or imprisoned as a result of their jihadi terrorist activities. Israel and the international community bear responsibility to reveal the EU's gross violations of its diplomatic responsibilities and those of Josep Borrell, the High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, as well as the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. So, you know, here we have Dan Diker really saying that that the EU has totally signed up to everything the Palestinian Authority is doing, including its incitement to hatred, incitement to violence, the glorification of terrorism, and the EU's turning a blind eye, but is deliberately trying to build an illegal Palestinian state outside of a negotiated settlement between the Israelis and the Palestinians.
Absolutely. I was with Dan Diker actually just a couple of weeks ago in his office, and I think we may well do an interview with him for Trojan Horse. I'd just like to say something that Naomi Linda Khan, who you saw in that clip, said to me, and it's a very interesting way of putting it. The European Union is a colonialist power. What they're doing is trying to dictate to powers within the Middle East what they should and shouldn't be doing. They're trying to dictate what Israel's borders should be, and I'd just add a bit to that. They were wanting to take over all the European countries, including ours, and all I can say to that is thank God that we're out of the European Union. It is everything that our woke friends today described as a colonialist, imperialist empire. That's what the European Union is today.
Unelected European Commission and presidency, and unaccountable as well. But this also is dangerous as well, because we also hear that Ambassador Alan Baker, former legal advisor to Israel's foreign ministry, pointed out in July of 2022 that, for example, that the EU member states restored funding to 6 Palestinian civil society organisations designed by Israel as terror supporting organisations, rejecting evidence submitted by Israel that these organisations are linked to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine as an EU and US and Israel designated terror group. So it's not only that the European Union are helping to create a de facto Palestinian state, pumping billions of European taxpayers' money into trying to do so by building illegal Palestinian settlements in Israeli territory, but they are now behind the scenes also supporting Palestinian terrorist organisations with funding as well. So really we see that the role of the EU towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is playing a role that will perpetuate greater violence and terrorism in the region.
Yes, which makes me ask the question, are they actually, and I made this point earlier, are they actually trying to get rid of the Jewish state? Because they know full well that's what the Palestinian intention is. It's a colonialist power, the European Union, and it's almost as if we're in the 1930s all over again. Just as Hitler's persecution of the Jews was being denied then, the European powers are doing exactly the same thing now. It beggars belief, but I'm afraid there's a lot of evidence. But if I can, on a more encouraging note, and I believe that this is a prophecy that is now being fulfilled in our day, and it's in Ezekiel 36, chapter 36, and I'll just quickly read it. This is an excerpt. O mountains of Israel, hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord God, because the enemy has said of you, aha, the ancient heights have become our possession. Therefore, thus says the Lord, surely I have spoken in my burning jealousy against the rest of the nations who gave my land, that's what the Lord says, he calls it my land, to themselves as a possession with wholehearted joy and spiteful minds in order to plunder its open country. Therefore prophesy concerning the land of Israel and say to the mountains and the hills and the rivers and the valleys, thus says the Lord God, I have raised my hand in an oath that surely the nations that are around you shall bear their own shame. But you, O mountains of Israel, you shall shoot forth your branches and yield your fruit to my people Israel, for they are about to come.
Brilliant way to end the programme. So I really appreciate you coming in and sharing extracts of your new exciting documentaries coming up for you. Thank you. I want to thank you for watching this edition of the Middle East Report. It's important to know what the EU is doing, particularly as they are using European taxpayers' money to fund illegal Palestinian settlements in Israeli territory, and we can't allow that to happen. We need to speak up against this great injustice. So thank you for watching this week's edition of the Middle East Report.